Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the McConnell Center, it is a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. To the mayor and his wife, you do us a particular honor by being with us here tonight, so thank you for joining us. My name is Natalie Smith, and it has been my pleasure to serve as chair of the McConnell Scholars this past year. 2016 marks the 25th anniversary of the McConnell Center. Since its start in 1991, the McConnell Center has been able to give more than $3.5 million to nearly 250 top college student leaders. As a senior McConnell Scholar, I can personally attest to what that scholarship money means to us students. And I can also say how grateful I am for the opportunities afforded me by the center, from studying ideas and books I wouldn't have otherwise run across, to traveling through China, to interning in Washington, D.C. This program has been incredibly formative, and I'm so thankful for it as I graduate in a few weeks and prepare for the next chapter of my life. As it is our 25th anniversary year, in order to honor the center's successes, tonight we would like to especially highlight our civic education programs. There will be a ceremony at the conclusion of this talk tonight, but if you look at the sheet you were handed as you entered, it contains some additional information about the center's efforts to aid in the formation and education of the rising generation of Kentucky citizens. But now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our final public speaker for the Spring 2016 Lecture Series, who will be delivering this year's Daniel J. Utley Memorial Lecture. Dr. J. Winik is one of the nation's premier historians. He has degrees from Yale College and the London School of Economics, and his PhD is from Yale University. His two previous books have won numerous awards and have both been New York Times bestsellers. He has appeared on television programs broadcast around the world, and his work has been adapted into numerous TV programs and documentary films. Tonight, he is here to speak on his new book, 1944, FDR and the Year That Changed History, which we are offering for sale, and he is offering to sign during the reception at the conclusion of tonight's events. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our very special guest, Jay Winik.
You see, even for Mitch McConnell scholars, the learning never stops. Thank you for that warm introduction. I've got to say, I come from New England. I live in Washington, D.C., and to look out over that stadium is not a sight you see every day back where I come from. It's really quite spectacular. Now, on the way here, Greg was trying to tell me, and Jan Carson was trying to tell me, it's Louisville, not Louisville. So I don't know if I got that right or not. You can tell me at the end. But anyway, thank you for coming, and thank you for that warm introduction. And I'm a great fan of Mitch McConnell, and he's just done marvelous work for the university and for the McConnell Scholars, and it's a terrific program, and to see all of you supporting this, I just think is wonderful. So give yourselves a big hand. Okay, I know you guys have been waiting. Let me talk about my new book, 1944. It's called 1944, FDR and the Year That Changed History, and we're going to also talk about that and what it says about statesmanship as well. And in the introduction, she said my two previous books were New York Times bestsellers. Well, no self-respecting author, writer, and historian would fail to take notice or point out that this book, too, was a New York Times bestseller. I was waiting for it to overtake McCullough, and McCullough jabbed his finger into me, and he said, "Jay, you're pretty damn good," but he didn't want me to be so good that I passed him, and I didn't. Anyway, let's talk about our more serious subject at hand, 1944. 1944. It was not inevitable that the war would end as it did or even end well at all. In the West, the Allies were pinned down along the Gustav Line, facing the withering fire from the Germans. In the East, the Soviet Union still was talking about making a separate peace with the Nazis even at this late date in the war. So in other words, even at this point in 1944, the war and humanity remained very much in doubt. But what would commence in 1944 would not be only the most epic year of the war, but the most epic year of the entire 20th century. And it was against this backdrop that two great statesmen, two great leaders, FDR and Winston Churchill, would meet in Egypt to discuss what would happen next in the war, to talk about tactics, to talk about strategy, to talk about how to bring this terrible carnage and barbarism that had been raging for so long, how to bring it to an end. And as they were going to do that, I want to remind you about these two great statesmen, if I can, for a second. Think of Winston Churchill. Churchill with a cigar in his mouth, Churchill with his plummy voice, Churchill who, when one country after another was falling to the Nazis in Europe, refused to give up or give in, Churchill who roused his country when everything seemed to be in doubt, and he gave them hope when Western civilization seemed to be imperiled. And then there was Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt, crippled by polio, and yet he had been elected president not once, not twice, but 3 times, and actually a 4th time. Roosevelt, who when America seemed to be in the darkest throes of the Depression, uplifted the hearts of all Americans, giving them hope that there could be a new tomorrow. Roosevelt, who in the darkest days of World War II, geared up America with something called the Arsenal of Democracy. And these two great men were meeting to talk about what would happen next. But before they would talk about what would happen next, actually at one point when they were in Egypt, Churchill burst into Roosevelt's villa. And he said, "Mr. President, I've arranged a trip for you. You must come with me. We have to go see the pyramids. I've arranged it all." And at that point, Churchill looked it over at Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was seized with such customary enthusiasm that he actually tried to lift himself up out of his chair and to walk, a rare lapse because obviously he couldn't walk. But eventually the two men got into their cars, their motorcade motored over to the pyramids, and after they looked at the pyramids, then they sat down and they looked at the Sphinx. And the sun was setting, and the pink of dawn was ending, and at this point, Churchill looked over to Roosevelt and he said softly, he said, "My God, I love that man." And then at another point, he looked over at the Sphinx and he said, "I wonder what she has to say." But the Sphinx said nothing back. And then what did Roosevelt say at this point? Well, Roosevelt, uncharacteristically, obviously he was the wittiest of all conversationalists that we had ever seen, probably in American political life, he said nothing. As it turned out, he was as inscrutable as the Sphinx. And as we get deeper into the story of 1944, you'll see what I'm talking about. And then eventually, so they left Cairo, these two great statesmen, and they went over to Tehran, where they would meet with the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, to talk about the policies and the plans to bring this war finally to an end. They talked about generals. They talked about the Second Front. They talked about the Soviets bleeding and dying in the snowy wastes of eastern Russia. And as they talked about all this, at one point there was a very tense moment. Something happened. Roosevelt tried to speak, and he couldn't get the words out. Beads of sweat came down his forehead. And all of a sudden he was seized with pain, and he couldn't speak, he couldn't talk, and they quickly rushed him off into a room where he was examined by his medical physician. And the medical physician looked at him, and he diagnosed it as something simple. He said it was nothing more than indigestion. And he said that Roosevelt would be ready to continue the rest of this Tehran summit. But as it turns out, this was an omen of much darker things to come. But anyway, they did continue the summit, and they made two very profound decisions in this summit. The first profound decision they made was that there would be a commander for the Second Front, which we know as D-Day. And that commander, it was assumed, would be George Marshall, but of course it would end up being Dwight Eisenhower, so that would be the first decision. And the second decision was that there would be a Second Front after all, and that it would come sooner rather than later. It would take place in June. And with that, after haggling for days, after all the talk of tactics and strategy and who would command what, and when the Second Front would finally be commenced and opened up, it was clear to Roosevelt that all was well with the war, and they now had the policies, and they now had the plans, and it all seemed to be right. And so when he flew back to the United States, when he flew back to Washington, he thought all was well, and the war would end sooner rather than later. But as he returned back to Washington, it turned out there was something still quite profoundly wrong. Roosevelt was sick. He had a nagging cough that wouldn't go away. He had a fever that continued to spike, and they couldn't make it stop. He would sit in the Oval Office, and as he went to sign his name, he could do nothing more but scrawl. And several times, much to their consternation and being stunned, the Secret Service would walk into the Oval Office, and they would see that Roosevelt was sprawled on the floor. He had fallen out of his wheelchair. In other words, Roosevelt was a deeply sick man. And at one point, Roosevelt went up to Hyde Park, where he was going to celebrate Christmas with his family for the first time in years. And he was going to do this by reciting Dickens. It was his ritualistic reading. It was something that made him very happy. But once again, he had this cough that wouldn't go away, the fever that wouldn't quit. And his family got so worried, especially his daughter, that she arranged for him to have a full workup at Bethesda Naval. And when Roosevelt had his full workup at Bethesda Naval, the young doctor, Dr. Bruin, had a very stern and very stark message which he imparted to the president. He said, if you don't get to rest, if you don't take immediate action, you're going to be dead within a year. And as it turned out, this terrible problems with his health, which was kept from the public at large, and indeed kept from many of the people in the White House themselves, would turn out to be prophetic. So what was to happen next? Well, it turned out that Roosevelt was a dying man. And why was this so important? Because he was a dying man when the two most critical, the two most important events of the war were about to take place. The first event was, of course, militarily, and that was the impending invasion of D-Day. D-Day, the greatest battle not only of World War II, but arguably the greatest battle in history, which would decide the outcome of this cataclysmic World War II. And then there was a second profound event that was about to take place at exactly the same time. And this event was not military, it was not diplomatic, it was not political, it was humanitarian. It was the gassing of the 750 to 1 million Hungarian Jews that was about to take place in the dark forests of Poland at a place that many people hadn't heard of called Auschwitz, where the gas chambers were. Now let me give you a sense of just what 750,000 to 1 million people means in concrete terms. If you filled up this entire stadium, and I didn't ask anybody what that is, but I would gather you can't get 1 million people into that stadium. And it's as if you took every person, every man, every woman, every child, every grandparent, every little boy, every little girl, every infant who came to one of the Louisville football games, and you gassed them in cold blood one by one. And that's what it would be like. But anyway, before that was going to happen, Roosevelt had to rest. He went down south to South Carolina to his good friend Bernard Baruch's, where he was going to recuperate. As he put it, I want to rest and sleep 12 hours a day. Well, he did sleep 12 hours a day, and he slept not only he was going to stay for just 2 weeks, he stayed for a month because he was so sick. But even though he was so sick, and as he was resting and as he was recuperating, it turned out the war was going well. The Allies finally, after great fighting, had seized Rome, and then Italy fell. And as Roosevelt would put it later, he would say, one Axis power down, one more to go. And then also the Allies did one other thing that was quite important to this story. They seized the airfields at Foggia in Italy. And with the seizing of the airfields, it gave them complete mastery of the skies, and they could roam 755 miles in any direction, including taking themselves over a place called Auschwitz. And then with the start of June, with the beginning of D-Day about to happen, the greatest armada in history assembled. Think of this. Picture it in your mind's eye if you can. Some 180,000 soldiers crossing the choppy waters of the Atlantic. Some 5,000 ships, battleships and transport ships in never-ending streams crossing these choppy waters of the Atlantic. And some 1,000 wide-belly aircraft soaring overhead, ready to rule and dominate the skies. And they were all converging upon 5 different beaches and it would be the greatest armada ever assembled in history. And if Normandy succeeded, it would not only be the greatest battle in history, but it would be the greatest act of statesmanship ever witnessed, and it would be the crowning glory and crowning achievement of FDR's presidency. But from the outset, it actually, as it turns out, the invasion was almost aborted. Why was it almost aborted? It was almost aborted because of the weather. Because as it turns out, great storm clouds had whipped up over a swath of some 180 miles. And this imperiled the ability to cross the waters. It imperiled the ability to rule the skies. And as these storm clouds were whipping up, they went even as far as where Adolf Hitler was now drifting into sleep, as Dwight Eisenhower is trying to figure out, do we go or not go with the invasion of Normandy? So he polled his top advisors. 6 said yes, 6 said no. So at this point, Eisenhower said, okay, let's have a pause. Let's take a few hours and think about it. And he went back to his command post where he went to sleep, and he got a little shut-eye for about 3 or 4 hours, and then he came back. And he talked to the meteorologist, and he said, okay, what's the weather going to be like? And still they didn't have good news. So one more time, they decided they would take a break, and then they would come back and see what would happen. But before they took that break, Eisenhower looked around to his men, and he said, how much longer can we leave this invasion hanging on a limb like this? And he said, I don't think much longer. So eventually he came back. They came back in 6 hours. And this time the meteorologist said, good news, temporary good news. There will be a pause. There will be a break in this terrible weather. And if we are going to start the battle, that is when it could happen. And so at that point, Eisenhower threw up his hands. He then sat on a couch. He paused. He walked around. And then he threw up his hands again. And then in his remarkable act of statesmanship, he said, okay, men, let's do it. Let's go. And as he said, let's go, great cheers went up, and the men were ready, finally, for this battle to begin. Now, so if this was what was happening on the Western side, on the Allied side, I want you to think of it. Picture now this in your mind's eye, the Nazi side. Erwin Rommel, the great German general, he was in charge of the Nazi efforts. He was pacing along the beaches, and he said to his men, he said, this war will be won or lost on the beaches. And then in a sad, rueful voice, he said, it will be the longest day. And indeed, it would be the longest day. And at that point, the Germans were looking out through their binoculars out into the seas, and they saw nothing. Nothing but water, nothing but sky. But then all of a sudden, out from nowhere, came this sight. The first sight was a ship, then another ship, then another ship, then tens of ships, then hundreds of ships. And then before he knew it, all he could see was nothing but ships. And at that point they said, Dora, 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 Dora. And with that, D-Day had begun. And with that also as well, began the greatest naval bombardment history had ever seen or witnessed. And the cannons went off, the ships began belching out their smoke and fire, and it was literally as if the primordial heavens had opened up their wrath. And quickly, the first 4 beaches were wrapped up by the Allies with no problem whatsoever. But on one beach, on Omaha Beach, the Allies were suffering just ghastly casualties. Men were being shot down and cut down one after another on the beach. The commanders were being shot down and cut down one after another at the beach. Men were lying face down, bleeding into the water. Heads were blown off, limbs were blown off, and it seemed that this would be a disaster. And in fact, Omar Bradley, one of the commanders of the Allied forces, he was looking out at what was taking place, and he said, my God, this is a catastrophe of irreversible proportions. But then at 7:30 a.m. in the morning, something happened. Even though most of the commanders were shot and dead and killed, all of a sudden, in a triumph of improvisation, one man, a colonel, yelled out in a loud voice, he said, men, we might as well die on hard land as we do in the water, bleeding into the seas. And at that, they began cresting the hills, and they began cresting the bluffs where the Germans were. And one after another, they went up, and eventually, in a miracle of miracles, they seized high land. And with that, it was clear D-Day was going to be won. It was going to be a great triumph. And it was at this point that a phone call was put into the White House. George Marshall woke up FDR at 3 a.m. in the morning, and Roosevelt got up, he sat up in his bed, he put on a light blue sweater, he picked up the phone, and he said, very good, very good. And what did Marshall tell Roosevelt? He said, the light of battle is in our men's eyes. And indeed it was in their eyes. And it was clear that D-Day was going to be won, the war was going to be over, and it was going to be sooner rather than later. But I want to remind you of one thing. As we look at these acts of statesmanship, diplomacy, and this commander-in-chief actions by FDR, I want to remind you of one thing. Even if the empire of war by the Nazis was crumbling under the withering assault from the Allies, one thing was not crumbling, and that was the empire of death. The empire of death at Auschwitz in the dark forests of Poland. And let me tell you a little bit about this empire of death. What would happen is all across Europe, but now particularly in Hungary, where up to 1 million Jews were being rounded up. And as they were rounded up, they were forced onto cattle cars. And on these cattle cars, they were rounded up, they were wedged in, and they had little food, no water. There was almost no air. And in fact, it was so bad, the conditions were so horrific, that many times the elderly, when they were rounded up, they would die, literally standing up. And at one point, a train carrying 4,000 children coming from, not from Hungary, but this train came from France, bearing 4,000 children. It pulled into Auschwitz station, and when the Germans opened up one door after another, what did they find? They found that every one of the children was dead. They had suffocated because they had no air. So eventually, though, for those who lived and made it on this train ride of these ghastly boxcars, when they got to Auschwitz, they saw a sight never before seen by common humanity. Firstly, they saw flames shooting 30 feet into the skies. They didn't know it at the time, but these were the infernos of the gas chambers. And then they smelled something. They smelled something like they had never ever smelled before. Again, they didn't know it at the time, but they were smelling broiling flesh that was coming from the gas chambers. And then what did they make of all this? What did they think of all this? Well, one little girl wasn't sure what to think of it. And she looked over to her father and she said, "Daddy, will there be playgrounds here like there are at home?" But another little girl had more of a fix on actually what was taking place. She said, "Of what use is a God when his only duty is to punish?" So when the Jews were taken out of the cars, they were tired and exhausted and they were enervated, and God knows they were scared. They heard the Germans screaming, shouting, "Raus, raus, raus, out, out, out." And as they stumbled along, they were being beaten one after another by the Gestapo. And eventually they ran into doctors. Not doctors like what you or I are familiar with, but Nazi doctors, who pointed for some of the people to the right, and they were going to the gas chamber. He pointed for some of the other people to the left, and they were going to become slave laborers, usually worked to death within a matter of weeks, sometimes within a matter of days. And then eventually, the people who were told to go to the gas chambers, always women, always children, always grandfathers, always grandmothers. Only the youngest and healthiest were spared. But the rest were herded into the gas chambers where they were told to take off their clothes because, as the SS put it, and they were so clever and so devious, they said, "You're going to take a shower." And then they were also told, "Put your effects on these hooks that we have here." And the idea was that they would take a shower and then they would come out and then they would just do nothing more than go to a work camp. But as it turns out, they were herded into these rooms, wedged in like bricks on the stone of a driveway. It was like, and then the lights would flick on and the lights would flick off. They would flick on and they would flick off, and the people would begin screaming. What was happening? The SS was toying with them. Even before killing them, the SS was being sadistic to the very end. And then all of a sudden there would be a clink, a little noise, and then there would be a hiss, and then out would come the gas. And then as the gas would come out, that's when the screaming would begin. And for 20 minutes, these people would be fighting for their lives, these Jews. They would be screaming at the top of their lungs. And eventually the screaming would become nothing more than a death rattle. And eventually the death rattle would become nothing more than a squeak. And then after 20 minutes, there would be nothingness. They would be all dead. And then within an hour and a half, the process would begin all over again. So the question was, for FDR, Commander-in-Chief, FDR, 4 times president, FDR, the man who presided over D-Day, FDR, who gave us the arsenal of democracy, FDR, one of the world's great statesmen, one of history's great statesmen. What would he do about what was taking place in Poland at Auschwitz? And the question was unanswered at the time. But there was one man at Auschwitz himself who was not willing to wait for FDR to make a decision about whether to do something or not. His name was Rudolf Vrba. He was a clerk at Auschwitz. He was a young man. He was remarkably healthy. And he was rare. The Nazis entrusted him as an administrator. And he knew everything that was taking place in every nook and cranny of the death camp. And he knew what was going to happen to the million Hungarian Jews, the worst butchery ever seen in the history of all humanity. And he resolved he would escape, and he would tell the Western world, and he would get word out to FDR, do something, save these people. So, with another colleague from Slovakia, they hid one night in a wood pile. And they reasoned if they could stay in that wood pile for 3 days, they could eventually make their escape. Because after 3 days, if they weren't successfully found, then it would be turned over to the Gestapo and the country at large, and it meant they could somehow make a run for it. So on the first night, they were lying bird-like. It was dark. They heard nothing at first. And they thought maybe they weren't even discovered. Maybe they weren't even found out at roll call. But then at 7:30 came, still they didn't hear anything. 7:45 came, still they didn't hear anything. But then so all of a sudden at 8 o'clock, they heard the sirens and they were discovered. They weren't discovered themselves, but that they weren't there was discovered. And they heard 2,000 dogs barking, ready to tear them to pieces. They heard some 4,000 SS troops and soldiers combing every bit of Auschwitz, looking for them, ready to shoot them at first sight. But they weren't discovered the first night. And then into the second night, as they were still hunched there, they heard these ghastly sounds, clink, clank, clink, clank. And they wondered, what were these sounds? Clink, clank. Well, as it turns out, these sounds were the sounds of the gas ovens still working overtime. Even as they were escaping, Auschwitz never ceased its ghastly business. And then on the third night, they were still okay. They still hadn't been discovered. And then all of a sudden they heard something else, another sound. This sound was not a frightening sound. It was not a horrific sound. It was an exhilarating sound. It was the sound of airplanes flying overhead. And then they heard bombs falling. And they thought, maybe they've come. Maybe they've come to liberate us. Maybe they've come to free us. But it turns out that they were bombing a few miles away as part of the oil war to degrade the Nazi war machine. But then after 3 days and 3 nights, these men, they pushed their way up out of their woodpile. They turned around, they saw the flames into the sky, a scene that they had never seen before. And then they turned around and they ran, and they never stopped running. For 17 days, they eluded Nazi patrols. They eluded the SS. They eluded the Gestapo. They eluded anti-Semites ready to turn to men. They actually eluded a shootout at one point where they almost got shot and killed. They eluded one peril after another. And then after 17 days, they eventually made their way to Slovakia, where they were smuggled in by some friendly Jews. And they met with the remaining Jewish elders, those who were still alive, and there weren't many of them. And over a beautiful dinner in which they had good food for the first time in years, in which they slept in a bed for the first time in years, they recounted every sordid detail of what was taking place at Auschwitz. And so the question was, what would happen next? Well, what would happen next is Vrba's memo, Rudy Vrba's memo, from what he told the elders in Slovakia. It was typed up into 30 pages, and it was relayed to Washington, first in condensed form, and it got there within a matter of weeks, and then in its entirety, and it got there, it actually took a couple of months. But Washington knew everything that was now taking place, and there was no doubt about the horror about to unfold. So once more, for FDR, the question would happen next, would be, what would happen next? And again, I want to remind you about FDR, all he did. It was FDR who gave us, when we most needed it, the arsenal of democracy. It was FDR, the great statesman, who in the darkest days of the Depression uplifted the hearts of all Americans, saying we can somehow get through it. It was FDR who gave us Lend-Lease, which when Britain was in the death throes of potentially dying against the Nazis, kept Britain alive. It was FDR who also gave Lend-Lease to the Soviets, who when they were being assaulted day after day, week after week, month after month by the Nazis, this kept them alive as well. It was FDR who was this great statesman, this great visionary, this great humanitarian. FDR who had done so much, but when this humanitarian was faced with the world's foremost humanitarian crisis, he flinched. And how did he flinch? Let me give you a couple of examples of that. Well, as it turns out, early in the war, there was a man named Breckinridge Long. Long was the Assistant Secretary of State in the State Department, and he was in charge of giving out visas. And there were some 200,000 Jews who had applied for visas, begging. They were cramming the doors of consulates all over Europe. And all Breckinridge Long had to do was say yes to them. And they would have been free. They would have lived. And instead, what did he do? He wrote a memo that he sent to all the consulates all over Europe. And it was one of the most dastardly memos ever written in this nation's history. He said, by various administrative devices, we can postpone and postpone and postpone. He said it not once, not twice, but 3 times, the granting of visas to the Jews. And in doing so, this became an automatic death sentence for some 200,000 of them. And so if that was one thing that was taking place, eventually it continued this way for several years. And eventually, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of Treasury, and probably Roosevelt's very best friend, and one of the most influential people in the cabinet, he had had enough of this. He had had enough of the State Department. He had enough of the foot dragging. He had had enough of the final solution that was unfolding. And even though they had unimpeachable evidence from all sorts of different quarters, nothing was happening. And it was at this juncture, his department would write the most heated memo ever written in this nation's history. And it was written directly to Roosevelt from the Treasury Department, and it talked about the government's acquiescence in the murder of the Jews. Imagine this being written to the hero of D-Day, the hero of the man who saved us from the Great Depression, to Roosevelt, who had conquered polio and risen himself up. And he was being accused of acquiescence in the murder of the Jews. And as soon as he got this memo, right away, Roosevelt swung into action. He called an immediate meeting on Sunday in the second floor Oval Office, where he talked with Morgenthau, and he said, "What do you want me to do?" And one of the things they did is they set up something called the War Refugee Board, whose sole intention was to do nothing but to help out the imperiled Jews. But in too many cases, not just thousands of cases, but in millions of cases, it was too little and it was too late. But even as now there was heightened attention on what to do and how to help out the Jews, there became a very profound debate that would take place. And this debate was whether or not the United States should bomb Auschwitz to put an end to the death halls taking place in Poland. And the question was, would it happen? Well, as it turns out, John McCloy, one of the legendary statesmen and wise men from the War Department, he said, we can't bomb Auschwitz, because as he put it, we don't have enough planes to do it, and it's too far for them to fly. But as it turns out, as Verba would attest to when he was trying to escape from Auschwitz and he heard the planes flying above, planes had been flying over Auschwitz for months now as part of the oil war to degrade the Nazi war effort and the Nazi war machine. So were there enough planes? Well, to be sure, it turns out there were enough planes. And then it was also said that it would be a diversion of resources, and it was something they couldn't afford to do. But as it turns out, around the same time, it turns out in Warsaw, in Poland, the Polish Home Army had risen up against their Nazi masters. And when they did that, Winston Churchill was desperate to help them out, desperate to give them relief, desperate to make a statement of the world that we're not going to allow them to be butchered. And as it also turns out, Roosevelt, he was equally desperate to do something. He was running for re-election for the 4th time, and crudely, and actually rather crassly, he wanted the Polish vote. But he also wanted to make a strong statement to the world that in their time of need, we stand shoulder to shoulder with our Poles. So what did we do? What did the Allies do? What did Franklin Roosevelt do? Well, for 4 days, he sent 127 flying fortresses that did nothing but drop and airlift material and weapons to the beleaguered Polish Home Army. And they did this, knowing full well that nonetheless the outcome would not be changed. They knew that the Polish Home Army would be butchered still at the end of the day, but they wanted to make a point loud and clear: in their time of need, we stand shoulder to shoulder with the Polish Home Army. So the question came up with the humanitarians at the time: if we can stand shoulder to shoulder with the Polish Home Army, why can't we stand shoulder to shoulder with the Jews? Why can't we stand shoulder to shoulder? But the fact is the decision was never made to bomb Auschwitz. But that's not true, because it turns out Auschwitz was bombed at one point, but it was bombed by mistake. It turns out, by mistake, at one point the planes flew overhead, they dropped their bombs, and the SS and the Gestapo ran into their bomb shelters. They barely put up any resistance. And think about the Jews for a second, if you can. They were so exhausted and worn and weary, they didn't even look like people. They looked like the walking dead. They looked like human skeletons. They were so exhausted and worn and weary that in most of their cases, all their hair had fallen out. They were so exhausted and worn and weary and so malnourished that most of their teeth had fallen out. They could barely stand. And those who couldn't stand, they could barely kneel down. And those who couldn't kneel down, they could barely even sit up. And they could all barely talk. But when these planes flew overhead and dropped their bombs, killing a number of Nazis with them, somehow these Jews found a way to stand up and to shout and to scream and to cheer. And as the Nobel Prize laureate Elie Wiesel, one of the great consciences of humanity, who then was a young boy in Auschwitz, he said, tellingly, something that he echoes to this day, he said, "We may have feared death, but we never feared that kind of death." So in other words, so what would happen in the end? Well, in the end, it turns out Roosevelt, this great president, one of our greatest presidents ever in history, Roosevelt, who did so much to win World War II, his health would give out and he would die. And then as he would die, eventually Hitler himself, he would watch Berlin being taken by the Soviets, and in a ghastly reprise of what he did to his Jewish victims, he would shoot himself and commit suicide, and then he would instruct his aides, actually, if you can believe this, to burn his body. So he would be lapped up in the fire, in fires and flame, just the way his Jewish victims were. But eventually the war was over. And when the war was over, at one point, the American forces themselves, they went and they liberated a small little Nazi death camp. This was not Auschwitz. It was not Treblinka. It was not Bergen-Belsen. It was nothing like that. But what they saw was like nothing they ever thought even could exist on the face of the planet. Eisenhower was there, and General Patton, one of our great generals who had seen everything in battle, he was there as well. And what they saw were these bony sticks of human beings who could barely stand. And at one point, the GIs tried to help out some of these bony sticks of what passed for human beings, and they gave them bars of chocolate. And these people were so malnutritioned that many of them died, literally just from eating a bar of chocolate. And at this point, Patton was so just riveted and horrified and disgusted by what he saw that he went and he actually vomited on the side of a field. And then, very tellingly, revealingly, it was at this point that Eisenhower said, upon liberating this small little death camp, again, which was nothing like Auschwitz, nothing like Treblinka, nothing like Bergen-Belsen, and he said, "Now, we finally know what we've been fighting for. We finally know what we've been fighting against." So how do we interpret 1944? How do we interpret the actions of this great statesman, this great commander-in-chief, this great president, Franklin Roosevelt? Well, in the end, crowds gathered all over Europe. They gathered in Ankara. They gathered in Paris. They gathered in London. They gathered in New York. They gathered in San Francisco. And they all said the same thing, the same song on their lips. They said, "Long live the great Americans. Long live the great American president, Franklin Roosevelt." And so this then was one of the triumphant fruits of 1944. But then there was another set of fruits of 1944, and these were not triumphant. These were fruits laden with pathos, fruits laden with sadness, fruits laden with possibilities of what might have been. These were the fruits of all those who perished in the Holocaust, who we could have helped and never did. And this was the other fruit of 1944. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll take questions now. And if anyone has any questions, I'll just... Yes, sir.
I've often wondered why that Hitler or Tojo neither made fun of or brought to light with propaganda that FDR was in a wheelchair. Never read where they tried to use that to discredit FDR. Have you run across anything on that?
Well, did you all hear the question? The question in part was that they made fun of, that Hitler made fun of and Tojo made fun of Roosevelt for being in a wheelchair. Well, for one thing, most of the American people, virtually 99% of the American people, had no idea he was in a wheelchair. I mean, this would be unthinkable today that we would have a president who was as sick and unable to move around the way he did. But there was an unwritten agreement among the press corps only to photograph him from the waist above. And indeed, at one point, I made mention of this Tehran summit. And at this Tehran summit, when Stalin, for the first time, met Roosevelt, it was very interesting. Roosevelt looked at Stalin, and he saw that he had pitted teeth, and he saw that his skin wasn't very good. And he thought to himself, he's a small man, but he carries himself very largely. And then what did Stalin do? Well, Stalin looked up, and he looked down, and he paused, and he stared at the shriveled legs of Roosevelt's, because he had never seen what he really looked like, and it stunned him. And I want to say one other thing. It's kind of an interesting observation. Hitler and Roosevelt despised each other. And Hitler, time after again, he would make speeches, and he would call Roosevelt a demented cripple. And Hitler, when the tide was finally turning after the Great North Africa campaign, which was the entree before the Italian campaign and then to D-Day itself, Hitler, he gave as good, Roosevelt gave as good as he got, and he began taunting back. Yeah, all the way back there. Yeah, it was September 1944. And again, I mean, the amazing thing about Verba's memo is Verba's memo was not the first time he had heard about this. Indeed, what Verba sought to finish by telling the Western world and by telling Roosevelt about what was taking place at Auschwitz, it turns out that a German industrialist named Eduard Schulte, and this is worthy of a Hollywood movie. I mean, he was the real Schindler. He despised the Germans. He hated I shouldn't say he despised the Germans. He despised the Nazis. He despised Hitler. He actually had met Hitler. And he was very highly placed in the regime. And at one point, he was at a party at Heinrich Himmler's. And think of this party for a second, if you will. Women were wearing their furs. They were wearing their diamonds, their pearls, their necklaces. Men were wearing their best suits or their finest military uniforms. And then in hushed voices, Schulte heard Himmler talking about something called the final solution. And what was the final solution? It was the attempt to eradicate every Jew from the face of Europe, if not every Jew eventually, from the face of the planet. And at great cost to himself, in risking his life, not only his career, but his life, he undertook a series of clandestine meetings into Switzerland where he met with Jewish counterparts, and he said to him, this is the plan. And if Roosevelt doesn't do something, there are going to be what he called giant cemeteries all over Europe. And so this was the beginning of the leaking out of the information about the final solution. And so, again, Verba gave unimpeachable evidence, but in some ways so did Schulte because he was so highly placed in the regime, because it wasn't propaganda, it wasn't coming from an American, it wasn't coming from a Pole, it was coming from a German himself. Yes, sir, back there.
Hi, I'm just curious. There's sort of a cottage industry on the left of Roosevelt apologist. And I'm just curious, as you've portrayed these facts, if you've seen a sort of a coordinated pushback against what you've revealed in your book.
Yeah. Did you all hear that? This is certainly not a question I'd get at the New York Historical Society. The question that he asked is, given what I've written, and in part saying that Roosevelt was less than perfect, I guess let's put it that way more diplomatically, has there been pushback because he is saying that there have been, I think as he put it, a number of apologists for FDR. This is, you know, look, when I wrote my April 1865, the book was a New York Times #1 bestseller, universally beloved, known worldwide, turned into a documentary special watched by over 50 million people, and I was just basking in a sea of love when I wrote that book. Couldn't have been better. When I wrote my book, The Great Upheaval, also a New York Times bestseller, best book of the year, again, I was basking in a sea of adoration and love. When I wrote 1944, this was a big subject, a big topic. To be sure, it's a gripping narrative. It's a gripping story. But here I am talking about FDR, widely regarded as our third greatest president. And I say many good things about FDR. I say he was a great wartime leader. I say that he was a great orator. I say that in many ways he was reminiscent of our two best presidents, Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. Although one thing I have also said, and I want to add this to my talk, I say, unlike Abraham Lincoln, and I think the comparison is quite profound and quite telling. And I'm one of the few historians in America who's done Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. So I have some comparison, a measure of comparison to talk about one president compared to another. And I said that Franklin Roosevelt missed his emancipation moment. And what do I mean by that? Well, think about what Lincoln did in the Civil War. And of course, I need to remember I'm down south saying this. Lincoln in the Civil War, galvanized by a great sense of high purpose as well as strategy and tactics, he eventually promulgated the Emancipation Proclamation, which would free the slaves, really at the time only in the South, but it would still be a powerful statement, and it would free the slaves. And he did that even though it was something that was seen with horror in most of the North. It was seen as horror within the Democratic Party. It was seen as horror even by many within his own cabinet itself. But Lincoln did it because it was the right thing. When he found the opportunity, he issued it. Now, what about Roosevelt? Now, to be sure, what could Roosevelt have done about the Jews early on? Well, he could have issued those 200,000 visas that were just waiting to be had. He didn't have to go to Congress for it. He didn't have to get anybody's permission. All he had to do was say yes, and 200,000 men, women, and children would have been saved. He didn't do it. But also, there were a number of things he couldn't have done for part of the war, because militarily, we weren't in a position to liberate the camps themselves, even when we first got the first initial glimpses of what was taking place. But 1941 is not the same as 43. And 1943 is not the same as 1944. And to be sure, we had plenty of opportunities to do something about Auschwitz. To be sure, we had the opportunity to bomb that death camp. To be sure, we had the opportunity to make a strong statement to the world that this kind of barbarism cannot last. It cannot be tolerated. It is something we can never be silent in the face of. So what has been the response by many of the acolytes of Roosevelt? And I think the best way for me to say this is a book that I've written with a heavy heart. I've done it not with glee, but with a measure of sadness, a tincture of sadness. Because more could have been done, more should have been done. I don't do it out of anger. I do it out of a sense of this was something that Roosevelt should have done. I think for many of those who see Roosevelt as being really a demigod who has done no wrong, it's been very hard for them to swallow. And I will say that in the discussions I've had, and the debates I've had, and the public appearances, I don't think I've really had anyone say you're wrong. But it's almost like an argument within your own family. You just don't want to hear it. But I'm confident. I'm quite confident. Just the way, for example, in my April 1865, I talked about the great act of reconciliation between the North and the South that took place at Appomattox. That's now the reigning orthodoxy. I'm confident that over time, we will continue to see Roosevelt as a great president, but we will always see him as a president, this man who is regarded as the world's foremost humanitarian. When confronted with the world's foremost humanitarian crisis, he somehow fell short, and that will always be a blot on his record. Yes, ma'am. Only if you can speak loud, you can speak up, otherwise they'll bring you a microphone.
You had mentioned the prowess of Rommel as a general, and it only recently came to my awareness that the Italian embassy, American embassy, had been broken into, and the code books that were in the embassy were photographed but not removed. Therefore, for the beginning of the war, especially in the African combat area, Rommel knew every move the Americans were going to make. Was he really a great general, or was he just blind lucky to have had access to all of the code books that revealed what the American plans were in
Right.
North Africa?
Right, well, the question is that we had access to some of the code books about the North African campaign, and so was Rommel really a great general? Rommel is an interesting figure, and to be sure, he's not central to my book, but he's central to the military elements of my book, because I talk about the three strands of the war. The first strand being a sickened Roosevelt, the second being the military campaigns, and then the third being the humanitarian, what was taking place to the Jews in a final solution. Rommel was charismatic, he was charming, he was a good warrior. I mean, I think he was by any measure, maybe not the greatest general that the Germans had or the Nazis had, but he was a significant general, and he was somebody who knew what to do with the information that he had. And I mean, when he looked at those beaches on Normandy, and he said this war will be won or lost on the beaches, he was prescient, and he was right. They would be won or lost on the beaches. When he said it would be the longest day, he was right about that. And then the other thing that I want to say about Rommel is, and this is something that reasonable people can debate, is Rommel may have been a good German, and a good general, and even a great general, but I don't believe he was a Nazi. I mean, maybe he lasted as long as he did, and then he put up a fight near the end where he was actually implicated in a revolt, in an assassination attempt by von Stauffenberg against Hitler. And Rommel was faced with this unpleasant decision where the SS marched into his home, and they said, we have cyanide pills in one hand and a revolver in the other, and they said, either you commit suicide in the next 15 minutes, or we will kill your family. And he committed suicide with the cyanide tablets. So I think for that we have to give him his just due. And then since we're in the South, I want to remind you of another great battle that took place during the Civil War. And that was the bloodiest day in American history ever, the Battle of Antietam. Well, as it turns out, because General Lee's battle plans had fallen, and they were wrapped up in a cigar, and they had fallen and they were found by the North. And so the North had they knew exactly what was going to happen. And still, even though it was seen as a great victory for the Union, it was a great victory, not because it really was a victory, but because it stymied Lee from his ability to go north, and it was a draw against the great Robert E. Lee. And so even there, we still give credit, though, to the Union, even though they had advance notice. Yes, sir. You.
Before the war started, a passenger ship left Germany filled with about 1,000 Jews seeking asylum somewhere in the world.
Yeah.
They thought Cuba might take it. Cuba turned it away. Then they tried the United States.
Right.
And there was, I feel, a sense of anti-Semitism in Roosevelt. And my question is, did Roosevelt feel that anti-Semitism? The ship was basically turned away and ended up going back to Europe, and most of those people died in the Holocaust. But
Right.
I want to, Was
Did
this
he
sense of-
feel anti-Semitism on the part of the American people, you're asking?
Yeah, I'm asking,
Yeah.
did Roosevelt feel, and I think Roosevelt felt that when they turned the ship away.
Well, this man is asking a very good question. It's about the ship St. Louis, what we now call the Voyage of the Damned, in which it was carrying some 800 Jews, and they were fleeing obviously Hitler in Europe. This was in the earlier stages, and they originally went to Cuba. Cuba wouldn't take them. What's the French statement? The more things change, the more things stay the same. And then they went and they were by the shores of Miami. And they were so close that they could literally see the buildings lit up. And they sent a cable to FDR, got no response. They sent a second cable to FDR, and they got no response. And eventually the ship had to turn around and go back to Europe, and indeed it was even trailed at one juncture by a Coast Guard ship to prevent the Jews from jumping in the water trying to get to safety on the American shores. And then your question is did Roosevelt, was his inaction in part because of anti-Semitism? I think that's what you're asking. And that's a good question. And what we now know is that for certain there was a good measure of anti-Semitism in America. And what was said, and what is said today among many of those who say that Roosevelt really couldn't have done much more for the Jews, because they would say that he didn't want to have a fight in the war just for the Jews. But that's a little bit of a misnomer, a little bit of a red herring, because again, the war in 1940 or 1941 was different from the war in 43, and it was certainly different by the war in 1944. By 1944, when we were winning on D-Day, when we were winning on the shores of Normandy, when we had taken Rome, when we had seized Italy, when we had triumphed in the North Africa campaign, at this point, Roosevelt, his popularity was so great and so vast and so significant that I believe the American people would have followed him to the edge of the earth. They would have followed him to the moon if he had asked them to come. And then I want to remind you of one other thing. And since this is in part this series of lectures about statesmanship, statesmanship is not about doing the easy things. It's about doing the hard things. And Roosevelt, having gotten the war to where militarily we wanted it to be and needed it to be, this was a time when some 1 million innocent souls were desperate for help, desperate for assistance. And this was a time when Roosevelt could have made a difference, and he chose not to. And that's one of the puzzles, one of the riddles that I try to unlock in my book, 1944, and that history is to continue to unlock. How could this man, who was seen to have had such a large heart, shown no heart at all for these people who needed it so desperately? Yes, sir. Yeah.
This will be the last question.
Oh, okay.
At Yalta, we believe we know now that Stalin, particularly on the topics of land division after the war, governments after the war, Stalin had no intention of living up to the agreements that he made. Do you think Roosevelt and Churchill knew he had no intention and they just needed to get him to make these commitments? Could you talk a bit about the relationship of those three at Yalta?
Yeah, the question is about the relationship of the three leaders of the alliance, of the Western Alliance at Yalta: Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. And what the gentleman said is that wasn't it clear to Roosevelt and to Churchill that Stalin had no intention of living up to his commitments. And what we're really talking about is the satellite countries of Eastern Europe, and mainly what was going to take place in Poland. And Churchill cared very deeply and very strongly about this. And Poland meant a great deal to him. And he was adamant that there be something, at least there be elections, so that perhaps there would be a free and democratic government. Now Roosevelt's a little more interesting here. Roosevelt, remember, he was a very sick man. And not only was he sick, but at Yalta he was dying. In fact, when Churchill saw him, and when Churchill's doctor saw him, he said, "My God, we have just seen a dying man." I mean, his collar was way too big. He was gaunt. He was haggard. He barely could speak. He mumbled a lot. He needed position papers more. He wasn't a commanding or towering presence that he was at the Tehran summit or in his summits with Churchill. But at one point, Roosevelt did exclaim, sort of rather heatedly, he said, "My God, what am I supposed to do, go to war all over again for Poland?" I think they knew that Churchill wasn't going to live up to, not Churchill, but that Stalin wasn't going to live up to his promises. But sometimes in diplomacy, it's the art not of the necessary, it's the art of the possible. And I think that was the best deal they could have gotten. So I wrestled with this question, how do I judge Roosevelt? And I think he got about as good as he could have gotten. You've all been great. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Winik. At this time, we're going to have a drawing for Dr. Winik's book. So if you would do us the honors.
Alex, dress a meeting.
Okay. Should we draw another one?
We have a book already.
Okay.
Well, you should match it. Buy another. Pope Brown. Pope Brown?
Now I'd like to call the director of the McConnell Center, Dr. Gary Gregg, to join me on stage. Tonight we honor one of our former scholars. Daniel H. Utley graduated from the McConnell Scholars Program in 2001. Following the terrorist attacks of 9/11, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, where he served admirably with multiple deployments related to the War on Terror. We lost Dan in 2012, and in 2013, the McConnell Center established this memorial lecture. Mr. and Mrs. Utley, thank you for being with us here again this year as we remember your son and a real Hall of Fame McConnell Scholar. Dr. Winik, on behalf of the McConnell Center, I thank you for being here with us this evening, and it is our honor to give you this token of our appreciation for serving as the Daniel H. Utley Lecturer for 2016. For another special presentation in the conclusion of this evening's festivities, I turn over the microphone to Dr. Gary Gregg.
Thank you, Natalie, both for your emceeing tonight and for your leadership at the McConnell Scholars Program this year. Thank you, Jay, for your I can't say uplifting comments tonight, but very thought-provoking for sure. Can I please call on Glenn Manns now to come to the stage, and Milana Salyer, Kelly Hanlon, Lipta Grider-Jones, and Benjamin Geese. After numerous conversations in the early 2000s about the state of American politics, about the state of civic education and the education that we were giving our rising American citizens, Senator McConnell and I set about raising money for and then creating a program that would, we hoped, do something to contribute to the quality of civic education, social studies, economics, history, geography, government, politics, and the like in Kentucky schools. Over the years, the vaunted subjects of STEM, which are very important, but which our fellow Kentuckian Wendell Berry likes to call SMET instead, have, of course, taken up so much more time in their classrooms and much of the prestige and much of the time and effort and energy that was once given to the subjects that we might call citizenship education. This year, in fact, our state legislature almost stopped social studies itself from being tested. And it took a profound set of efforts, time by some of the people on stage now, many of you in the audience, to salvage social studies in Kentucky schools. Well, the McConnell Center in 2005 began our civic education program. We're a small program, we're a small staff, but over the years we've been able to reach about 500 Kentucky teachers with our educational programs. We have sent teachers to 30 historic locations to study and to bring experiences back to their classrooms, from Boston, Massachusetts to Portland, Oregon, from George Washington's Mount Vernon to Mount Rushmore, from Monticello to Mount Sumter, or Fort Sumter. We have given more than 40,000 pocket constitutions to Kentucky students without ever charging a dime. We've given 125 or so different titles as either classroom sets or to individual teachers, as individual books to teachers for use in their classrooms and in their professional development. We've brought more than 300 speakers, like Jay Winik tonight, to our teachers in Kentucky and our students. We have published books, published studies, a new one of which on civic education will be released in the fall. We have had programs covered nationally on C-SPAN and public television, and our next conference that I welcome you all to will happen on May the 21st, and it will be considering women leaders in Kentucky political history. Again, we're a small team, and with the help of our dedicated teachers and our partners and our donors and our friends, we think we've been able to have some degree of impact on the quality of citizen education in Kentucky. We surely hope we have. These four on stage, 5 on stage, I can't count, with us tonight have been the core of our staff and our partners in these efforts over the last decade. But of course, nothing we do would be possible, nothing we do would make any difference if we didn't have very dedicated teachers, not only to do the basics in the classrooms, but in their classrooms, but then come out on evenings like this, or spend Saturdays with us, or go and spend part of their vacation time with us. Though it's spring break and many of our teachers that I know wanted to be here with us tonight couldn't make it, we do have a considerable number of teachers that we've worked with over the years that have been able to be with us tonight. They've contributed to our programs, they've contributed to us, and they've become our friends. I think it's not too much to say. Ladies and gentlemen, if you bear with me, could I please ask all the teachers in the audience to please stand and be recognized, and for the rest of us to offer our thanks for the work that they do for our rising generation of citizens in Kentucky. Don't be shy. Thank you all. When we have the reception in a little while, I hope you'll talk to some of them, because this evening is really, the rest of the evening is about them. As part of our 25th anniversary that Natalie mentioned to you, and our celebrations that we'll have throughout the year, we have decided to begin a new award as an appreciation for those who have spent a good portion of their careers and their lives dedicated to the vital project of Social Studies and Civic Education. For that special occasion, we have commissioned, excuse me while I go for a prop now. For this special occasion, we have commissioned Louisville's own renowned glass artist, Brooke White of Flame Run, to design and to create a special mint julep cup in honor of our awardee tonight. Over the last decade, I think it is fair to say that there has been no one in Kentucky who has done more and served more tirelessly the cause of civic education than the person that we honor tonight. Glenn Manns. Glenn Manns is a graduate of Berea College and EKU, both of which we are forgiving him for tonight. He is, however, a Wildcat fan, for which we will not forgive him. Over the years, he has been a classroom teacher, including teaching and mentoring Glippy on the stage here tonight. And we don't blame him for that either. He has been a history curriculum specialist for the Ohio Valley Educational Cooperative. He has been and remains Region 4 Social Studies consultant. But what he does for civic education goes way beyond his paid employment. He has been the single reason we still have programs in Kentucky for high schoolers like We the People. He has been the driving force behind the Kentucky Council for Social Studies. He is the reason AP History Saturdays are still offered in parts of Kentucky for our students. Frankly, we'd be here all evening if I went down the list of the programs that he has either created, implemented, or sustained, mostly without pay or accolade. It would be a long evening indeed if we outlined all the professional development that he has been part of and he has contributed to, or all of the countries that he has gone to serve as an ambassador for civic education in Asia, Europe, and Africa. Let me just say this. Not only was Glenn the natural choice for being the first recipient of this award that we give tonight, but frankly, it is not an overstatement to say that Glenn Manns is the reason we have the award at all tonight. It is been created to honor him and his work. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the McConnell Center's great privilege to award the first Henry Clay Cup for Excellence in the Service of Civic Education to our friend and co-conspirator in informed citizenship, Mr. Glenn Manns.
Thank you, Gary, for the extremely kind words and for the recognition. Didn't expect this at all. When we spoke, Gary was like, I want you to just say a few words about the 25 years of the McConnell Center and the civics programs. So I prepared a couple of brief remarks there. So thank you. I'm just very overwhelmed by this. When you do this for a while, you sort of don't really realize how quickly the time passes and the friendships that are developed. I remember my first interaction with the McConnell Center was working with Milana Salyer on the Southern Coalition with Natalie Bolton at that time. And then I remember getting a phone call from Milana saying, hey, would you like to go to New Mexico and study the Federalist and Anti-Federalist? And I was like, sure, because because people of my ilk, that's what we really consider good stuff, you know. So that's where I met Gary and Gordon Lloyd. And from there, I've been to many other events, and it's just been a blessing to interact with such great people, and also provide opportunities for teachers and students. And that's the one great thing about this program. I think for all the teachers that are here, all the educators here, all the folks who love civic ed and who seem, you know, to rally around even despite, you know, getting short shrift and things like that. I think the social studies example was a great example of you know, that. The one common thing that you'll hear from folks is the quality of the opportunities that the McConnell Center offers for teachers. And the collegiality is part of it too, but just the rigor and just sort of the cohort that it has built over these years. I've been very blessed. I had Glippy as a student in 8th grade, and I would like to, you know, maybe make myself feel better to say maybe I actually taught Glippy a little bit of something in 8th grade. I don't know about that. She was a brilliant student, but it brought joy to me to see you and what you do today in terms of this working with civic ed. We've had some other students from Owen County become McConnell Scholars too, and that's part of the programs as well. I'm looking out in the audience and I see Dr. Tom Mackey back there, and Gary. We have been to some pretty far districts to help bring civic ed and AP Saturday to places. And when I was running TAW programs at Shelbyville, at OVEC, the collaboration that we had. I remember, I see Mark McMillan sitting there, the first time that we had Josiah Bunting do a collaboration with us and so forth, and his presence. So for all of the opportunities that the McConnell Center provides, for all of the opportunities for teachers and students, I'm very grateful for that, because in this time of when our country probably needs more civic education, not less, you guys have been a beacon to help provide that. So I thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. It is a mint julep club. You may drink out of it, yes. Keep in mind that is a one-of-a-kind, hand-blown item I can't replace. So,
I'll just put that on the shelf.
all right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight. Alex, congratulations on winning the book that you turned down. But thank you for being here. Mayor Fisher, thank you for being here. We have members of the Board of Overseers here and Board of Trustees. We appreciate you being here. Louisville Metro Council, thank you all for being here. But of course, tonight is really about civic education and about our teachers. So thank all of you. If you would all, I hope please join us now in the back of the room where we have some refreshments set up. And Jay, I can see, is already signing books back there of people that snuck back. So thank you all for being here tonight. Have a good trip home.